Welcome once again for episode number 6 in our series of 7. We have one more after this week. Just to remind you where we've been, we've gone through these 5, and tonight we're on how the church later developed worship services. Just to recap where we've been, I do this every week just in case some of you are just catching up with us. Why didn't the early church have worship services? Well, they didn't describe their meetings as worship. This is verifiable by looking in your New Testament. They didn't describe them as services, so they didn't certainly describe them as worship services. They also saw their meetings as horizontally focused gatherings, not as formal vertical ceremonial events that were offered to God like we tend to look at our worship services today. Another key fact as to why they didn't have worship services is that if you actually study the word worship in the New Testament and the Greek words behind it, you find out that the Bible's worship words refer to temple activities, such as prostration and offering sacrifices, literal sacrifices, not to Christian assembly activity. And that one week number 4, I think it was, we looked at how preaching is also not an assembly activity, but encouraging and teaching one another are assembly activities. And I think there's a fine distinction between what teaching is and what preaching is, but we need to figure out what that difference is and figure out how we could be improving what we do pulpit-wise in our churches. So tonight is on how worship services developed. I'd like you to put on your archaeologist hat and get out your archaeologist shovel and your archaeologist broom, and we're going to dig through the ruins of hundreds and hundreds of years ago of old Christian writings that are not in the New Testament, but just outside of that. And I'm going to show you some of this stuff that's been dug up that deals with our topic. And you take a close look at it and see if we can come to some reasonable conclusions based on it. And what we're basically looking for is how worship services developed. Because when I first came across the idea that, why doesn't the New Testament call the assembly worship? And once I found out that it's not there, I thought, well, maybe, just maybe, they did call it worship, but none of the Christian New Testament documents that we have happen to use it. Maybe there's some other documents, like the lost letter to the Corinthians, that used it all the time, but we just didn't have that one, and so maybe they still used it, but we just happened to catch the wrong documents from the first century that didn't use the word worship. Well, so one way to check that out let's go beyond the New Testament, right into the era right after the New Testament, and study all those early Christian documents and see if those guys referred to the assembly as a worship service. Well, as it turns out, they didn't do it either. So I sort of cut to the quick, and that's the end of tonight's presentation. Good night, drive safely. But it's interesting to dig into this and to figure out why and how this worship terminology eventually developed. It's an interesting study. What we're going to look at is church writings. We already know that in the first century, that's when the New Testament documents were produced. And so when we read in our 27 books of the New Testament what they're doing there, we're finding out what was true for them in this period of somewhere between 45 and 95 AD. I know the dates of some of these documents are debated. That's not really important for our purposes here. The second century produced a wide variety of Christian literature, from guys like Clement of Rome and the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas. You may or may not have heard of all these guys. Justin Martyr, the letter to Diognetus, the Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, one of my favorites. The third century, Tertullian also lived in the third century as well. He's in the late second and early third. Hippolytus of Rome, Origen of Alexandria, Cyprian of Carthage, Minucius Felix, now there's a name, and Gregory Thaumaturgus. These guys are all writing, and we have their writings. Plus, we also have a bunch of 4th century stuff from these guys, Eusebius and Lactantius and Arnobius and Hilary and Ambrose and Cyril and Gregory, a couple of different Gregorys. All these folks, we can dive into their literature and see what they said about this topic. Now, a lot of these writings are found in this 9-volume work called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, A-N-T-E, Ante-Nicene, N-I-C-E-N-E. It's talking about the period before the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea took place in 325 A.D., so everybody we're looking at here is pre-Nicaea. These 9 volumes are in small print, and each page has 2 columns of text, and it goes on for thousands of pages. So for me to find the word worship in these, yeah, you're already thinking I must be crazy. There's some truth to that. But luckily, what I did first when I started doing this back 20 years ago, I got a digital copy of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, so that I've got it on CD. I had it on a CD back then. You remember CDs? Yeah, what is that? Yeah, but I could just type in the word worship and then boom, search through every document, every volume of this thing and cough them all up. There are about 2,500 references to the word worship. And now you're thinking, yes, this guy really is sick and demented and something's wrong with him. But I looked them all up and studied them and tried to figure out the context in which it's being used and the sense in which it's being used. And yes, it's still the case that by and large, for the most part, those are important words, they're still not describing their assemblies as worship or as worship services until a certain point. And so we're gonna pour through this stuff and see what we've got in all these documents. First, we're going to study how early Christians described their assemblies. We already know from the New Testament documents that they pretty much describe them as gatherings, as an assembly. The Greek word ekklesia you may have heard of before. The word is commonly translated as church. It means an assembly. They came together. That's how they described these meetings. That's what they did. They didn't gather to worship. They just came together. But now if you look, by the way, let me back up a second. I want you to get accustomed to what the grid is here. You're going to see this on 40 or 50 different slides here tonight. This is a timeline. Starts over there at AD 50, like New Testament era, goes through 350 AD. And up there in the corner, you're going to see a blue dot that signifies roughly the dating of the document we're going to discuss. And it's going to move to the right, and you're going to be able to see the advancing of time, because the dating of these things becomes very important. And you're also going to see this little word CA dot. CA is the abbreviation for the Latin word circa, thank you, which means we get the word circle from. It means around this time. It's a rough date, and it's difficult to date most of these documents precisely, a lot like the difficulties you have in dating New Testament documents. But so I'm going to put circa there so that you know that it's roughly that time. So even as early as 100 AD, you see this statement in the Didache. The Didache, the word means teaching. It's a Greek word. And the more longer title of this document is the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. We knew that this document existed, but we didn't have any copies of it until, I'm guessing it was like 1888. This guy discovered one in the Middle East, an actual copy of the Didache. We got one, and we knew that it had been referred to. We knew it went fairly far back, and we finally got a copy of the Didache. And it's pretty cool to read this thing, and you see how they're talking about church proceedings. It's called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, but it's not really the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, but they often would entitle these things like that. So anyway, but in the Didache, it talks about their assemblies. It's kind of a church manual produced very early on to try to instruct churches about how to do stuff. and what the ministers are supposed to do and when, and what's supposed to happen in the assembly, and how you deal with the Lord's Supper and stuff like that. It's a very interesting book. If you ever get a copy of it, you got to take a look at that. It's pretty interesting. But it refers to them gathering together, and it uses the same terminology we see in the New Testament. It says, on the Lord's own day, we gather together and we break bread and give thanks. There's other things in the Didache, but this is still shows that the terminology is similar to what we see in the New Testament. About 105, a couple years later, Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch in Asia Minor, he writes several letters. One is to the Ephesians. He says to the Christians there, give diligence, therefore, to come together more frequently for thanksgiving and the glory of God. For when you are frequently together in one place, the powers of Satan are destroyed. So he's talking then about gathering together again. Again, the word worship is not used. He doesn't say come together to worship God, but you get the idea. It is for thanksgiving and for the glory of God. There's other things in Ignatius as well, but this shows that he's also using a lot of the New Testament terminology. This is an interesting letter, the letter of Pliny to Trajan. Pliny was a Roman governor up in northern Asia Minor. Pontus. Pontus is an area that's referred to actually in the New Testament. And he's writing to Trajan, who happened to be the Roman emperor at this time. And he's writing about the difficulties they're having in their area with those Christians. And he wants some advice from the governor about what do we do with these Christians. And in this letter that has survived to this day, it dates to about 112 AD, he says, the Christians affirmed to me that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, and when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, and after which it was their custom to separate, but then reassemble later on in the day to partake of food. Again, it's the assembling and the meeting idea there, but you get an idea of also what's going on. But remember, this is through the eyes of a Roman governor and not through the mouth of a Christian, but he's telling the evidence that he'd heard from Christians that he had questioned and even put in jail. That's also an interesting story if you want to look that one up. The Epistle of Barnabas is another one of the documents that's in the so-called Apostolic Fathers. The book of the Apostolic Fathers it's not really the fathers of the apostles, it's really their sons, but that's the term that's been thrown at them, the Apostolic Fathers, and it's a bunch of writings that mostly come from the 2nd century, and the Epistle of Barnabas is one of them. Nobody really thinks that the Epistle of Barnabas was written by Barnabas, but it's still a very interesting document. And he says to Christians, don't, by retiring apart, live a solitary life, but coming together in one place, make a common inquiry concerning what tends to your general welfare. Talking to Christians and the importance of them coming together. Again, the idea of just this gathering continues from the New Testament to this era. A little bit later in 125, 2nd Clement has this document, or this statement. Let us come together more frequently and strive to advance in the commandments of the Lord in order that all of us, being of one mind, may be gathered together to life. Again, the idea of coming together and gathering together. Still much there. He does not use the word worship to refer to what they did in assembly. Then around 160, a guy named Justin, writing from Rome. He's called Justin Martyr because he became a martyr. But he writes this apology. And an apology is from the Greek word by that same name, basically, but it means a defense. It's not sort of an apology, but it's a defense of Christianity to those who were attacking Christianity at the time. And he's describing what they do. He says, on the day called Sunday, there is a gathering together in the same place of all who live in a city or rural district. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. And then when the reader ceases reading, the president, in a discourse, admonishes and urges the imitation of these good things. Interesting. He goes on with a bunch more things, but again, he does not describe their assemblies as worship, but as a gathering. And then there's this other document about that same time, 165, called the Martyrdom of the Holy Martyrs, which is actually here talking about the martyrdom of Justin, the guy I just quoted. Justin was put to death for his faith. About this time, it's getting to be a real thing that the Christians strove for. Boy, I hope I get to be executed for the cause of Christ, because people really revered the commitment and the sacrifice of these individuals who did this. And I say guys, it wasn't just guys. There was a lot of females who also were burned at the stake or beheaded or killed on behalf of their faith. But in this document, this is recording this exchange between Rusticus, who I think is the prefect who is examining Justin, and he says, "Where do you guys assemble, you Christians?" And Justin says, "Well, where each one chooses and can. Do you think that we all meet in the same place? No, because the God of the Christians is not is circumscribed by place." His point is a point that recurs in these early documents frequently. Christians understood that with the destruction of the temple, God is no longer circumscribed. He's no longer included or confined to a space or to a place. He is everywhere, so it doesn't really make a difference where Christians gather. And so Christians gather where they can and where they choose. And in the city of Rome, which would have had a lot of people at this time, and probably a good number of Christians, they're meeting in little cell groups here, there, and the other. And again, where were they meeting? Homes. That seems to be the practice for the first few hundred years of the church. So interesting exchange here between Rusticus and Justin. Advancing up to 200, Tertullian, in his apology, he says, "We meet together as an assembly and congregation. We offer up prayer to God as with a united force. We meet together in order to read the sacred texts." And he goes on with a little more description. But again, Tertullian, in his lengthy description of what they do, still does not use worship terminology to refer to the meeting. It's, again, think house church. Think sitting around somebody's living room. Think of small gathering, probably smaller than this one here tonight. That's the environment in which these meetings are taking place. And so to call it a worship service, certainly to them would have seemed really, really strange, if not heretical. We'll talk about that in a minute. Advancing up to 210, we get this statement from Bardesanes. He says, "Wherever we are called after the one name of Christ, Christians. On one day, the first day of the week, we assemble ourselves together." Again, he's describing what they do in their assemblies. He also does not use worship terminology. Jumping up about 100 years, up to 320, here's Eusebius, who we'll talk about extensively tonight. He says, "None of our brethren ventured to convene meetings or even to appear in public." He did not say that we might hold meetings, talking about the emperor, didn't say that we could hold meetings, build houses of assembly, or perform any of our other customs. He's talking about the emperor at his time forbidding these things, the holding of meetings in their houses of assembly. This phrase is interesting, houses of assembly. I looked up how this is translated in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, which was translated back in the 1880s. And it calls it houses of worship. But then I look closer at what the Greek is for Eusebius, and the word worship isn't there. They were sort of taking liberties with what it says. It's houses of assembly, houses of ecclesia, which is a word we all know. That's what he doesn't use them. He doesn't use the worship word here in Eusebius at this point. He will later. We'll see this in a minute. Also in 320, Eusebius also writes in his church history, he says, "The excesses of Licinius, the emperor, surpassed all others in savage cruelty. There, some of the churches of God were razed to the ground. Some were closed, so that no one accustomed to frequent them could get into them, nor render God the service that we owe." Now we're going up here. This is like 300 years after the time of Christ. And now they have churches. He's starting to use this term church to refer to a building. It's one of the first times this happens in history. Prior to this time, the word church is being used to refer to a gathering, to an assembly. But here they're calling them buildings. And this emperor went after the Christians and starts knocking them down. Yeah, you got a question?
I was just curious, Licinius, was he a leader at the time, or who was that?
Licinius, at the time this was written, he's one of two Roman emperors who were in charge of the Roman Empire. He and Constantine were co-emperors for a while, and that's what he's talking about here. We know that Constantine became very favorable to Christianity, but Licinius was not. That answers your question, all right?
Yeah.
This phrase also, neither render God the service that we owe. There's one of the translations of Eusebius's church history that says, render God the worship that we owe. So there the word worship pops up, but it's the Greek word latreia, which refers to offering up sacrifices, which is interesting use of the term. This term latreia is now starting to be used to refer to what Christians did in assembly. Interesting. But this is not till 320. Well, now let's jump up another 10 years. This is Eusebius again, another document that he wrote, an oration in praise of Constantine. He was Constantine's biggest fan, and he wrote a bunch of good stuff for them. Eusebius, by the way, is a bishop of the church at Caesarea. And he says this, our Savior, through Constantine, once more adorned the world with holy temples and consecrated houses of prayer in every city and village, ordaining the erection of churches and sacred buildings to the honor of the supreme God and Lord of all. These hallowed edifices are called churches or houses of the Lord. Interesting, what's happening here is Constantine, after he became a Christian, he started building churches. And we're not talking about these Morton buildings. We're talking about lavish, extravagant cathedrals. And Eusebius calls them holy temples and consecrated houses of prayer, sacred buildings, hallowed edifices. And here he described what he means by ecclesia, houses of the Lord. This phrase is interesting, houses of the Lord, because like temples, the phrase house of the Lord in the Bible only refers to the Jewish temple. And yet he's starting to call Christian church buildings temples, houses of the Lord. This had never been done before. And it's something of a departure from the ideas that we found in the New Testament. So let's come to one conclusion here based on what you've seen so far. By 320, Christians began using temple terminology in reference to their meetings and meeting places. But it's really not until we get closer to the 300s and the time of Constantine. We'll talk more about Constantine here in a few minutes. Let's go on to another question that we must face. What prompted Christians to start using temple terminology? You remember from week number 3 when we talked about the destruction of the temple. It was just totally destroyed. Jesus predicted it. He said that it was in fulfillment of all that has been written. All Christians knew in the New Testament and in the couple centuries thereafter, that they didn't build temples. So what in the world is going on? Why did Christians start using temple terminology? Now let's first, before we answer that question, let's understand how Christians viewed the temple. You already know from the New Testament how they viewed it. I've mentioned that already. But around 115, we're going back to the beginning, starting over again, and follow the development of thought through these early centuries on their thinking about the temple. The Epistle of Barnabas says, I'm going to speak to you about the temple and how those wretched people, he's referring to Jews here, set their hope on the building as though it were God's house. Truly, God dwells in us, he says. This is the spiritual temple that is being built for the Lord. We talked about that again in episode number 3. And this was, for sure, how Christians understood temple. I am the temple. Those buildings are totally unimportant. And this also comes from some pretty clear teaching in the New Testament. Advancing up 40 years to 155, in a document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Polycarp, by the way, is a bishop of Smyrna in Western Asia Minor, one of the 7 churches of Revelation, I think. Smyrna is one of those. And he's a bishop, and he's being martyred. He's in the Colosseum here, and they've got lions ready to go after him, and he's being questioned by the proconsul at this time, and there's a crowd watching. The entire crowd cried out with uncontrollable anger, and with a loud shout, said, "This is the teacher of Asia, the father of the Christians, the destroyer of our gods, who teaches many not to sacrifice or worship." Interesting. They viewed this bishop as teaching people not to worship. Oh, but you shouldn't be surprised at that, because once you understand that worship refers to temple stuff and offering sacrifices and things that took place in a physical temple, Christians didn't do that. Christians didn't even have a temple. But he was telling people, he was destroying their gods in a way. He was teaching against idolatry, and he taught people not to offer sacrifices. You don't do that anymore. This was the novel thing about Christianity. They didn't do the sacrifice thing. They didn't have temples. They did worship. Now, when he says worship here, by the way, this is the Greek word proskuneo, bow down. Christians didn't do that. He's not talking about, when he uses the word worship, he's not talking about singing praises to God or praying to him. Of course, Christians did that. But when this word is used here, that's what he's talking about. Ironically, it's the same meaning of the word worship in the New Testament when proskuneo is found. We talked about that in episode number 2. So on 160 now, advancing up a couple of years now. This is Justin Martyr talking again in his apology. He says, "What sober-minded man, then, will not acknowledge that we are not atheists, worshiping as we do the maker of the universe, who has no need of streams of blood and libations and incense?" It's interesting that Justin, in defending Christianity to the watching world, has to tell them, we are not atheists. See, the watching world thought the Christians were atheists. Why? Well, they didn't have temples. They didn't have altars. They didn't have priests. They taught against worship. I mean, how atheistic can you get? That was their perception of the Christians. But he has to say, no. We're not atheists. And he uses the word worshiping here. This is the Greek word sebomai, which we didn't talk a great deal about in episode number 2, but it could be translated as revering. Revering as we do the maker of the universe. Yes, Christians revere a God. They are not atheists. We just don't need these streams of blood and libations and incense, the sacrifices that go along with the whole temple thing. Now, advancing up to 200, Clement of Alexandria kicks in on this thing. He says the word, talking about the authoritative documents for the Christian world, the word prohibiting all sacrifices, prohibiting the building of temples, indicates that the Almighty is not contained in anything. He's citing scripture here, although there's not really a scripture that prohibits the building of temples, but it might depend on how you read John chapter 4 or a couple other passages where Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Why would Jesus then support the building of one? That's probably where he's coming up. But he thinks that the Bible prohibits the building of temples. And he's a Christian bishop in Alexandria, a well-regarded one. Now, advance up 30 years. This is Origen, who's also in Alexandria. He succeeds Clement there as the bishop there. He says, we object to building altars and statues and temples because we've learned from Jesus Christ the true way of serving God. Not that phony way that the pagans did and that the Jews did. We object to building temples and altars and statues. And then jumping up to the year 300, Arnobius is the last guy who's going to utter this same idea. We do not rear temples. We don't build temples for the ceremonies of worship. We don't set up statues. We don't set up images of any god. We don't build altars. Even as late as 300 AD, Christians felt this way. We don't do that worship stuff. We don't do that temple stuff. We don't do altars and all that stuff. But things start to change. So the conclusion of this segment so far is that in the first 3 centuries, Christians resisted viewing their meeting places as temples. So then, again, what's the question? what prompted Christians to start using temple terminology? And again, if you dig through all this volume of literature, you can start to come up with some pretty good answers. First, I see three shifts taking place in Christian thinking, and they're important ones. And they're shifts away from New Testament thinking and toward something else. And the first shift is that the Lord's Supper becomes a sacrifice. Really important point here. Let's start to look at the evidence here. Justin Martyr is one of the first ones who most clearly identifies this thought in 160 AD in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. He says, God speaks of those Gentiles, namely us, who in every place offer sacrifices to God. That is, Justin says, the bread of the Eucharist and the cup of the Eucharist. That is the sacrifices that we offer. So he's saying that when you take the Lord's Supper, you're offering a sacrifice. The interesting thing here is he's citing from Malachi 1:11, which says this. God is saying, he says, my name shall be great among the nations, and in every place frankincense will be offered to my name. Now that's what Malachi 1:11 says, both in Hebrew and in the Septuagint. But this verse was never used in the New Testament documents as a proof of Christianity. But in later documents in the 2nd century, early Christians started to use this verse as a prophecy that the Gentiles will now be included in the church and they will offer sacrifices as well. And they viewed that sacrifice as when they took the Lord's Supper. Kind of bizarre. And if you read Malachi 1, you would conclude these guys are nuts. That's not what it says. But a lot of them did it. And Justin's one of the first ones to take off on Malachi 1 as proof that the Gentiles will eventually become Christians and offer sacrifices. By the way, let me back up here. The reason why this is a prophecy of the Gentiles is the word nations here. Ethnoi, it's another word for Gentiles. That's why they connected Gentiles and nations. In every place, who in every place offer sacrifice, who in every place offer frankincense and such. It is a citation from Malachi 1. Irenaeus will do it, and Justin will do it a couple other times in his documents, again using Malachi 1. It got to be a favorite passage of the church fathers to refer to the Gentiles coming into the church. A couple years later, interesting document here, the Acts of Peter. Let's read what it says first, and then I'll describe it. This says, they brought bread and water to Paul for the sacrifice so he could distribute to all. The sacrifice? Paul's going to distribute a sacrifice? Rufina wanted to receive the Eucharist from Paul, but Paul said to her, Rufina, you are not coming to the altar of God in truth. This story, by the way, is apocryphal, as they say. It's spurious, to say the least. It's just made up stuff. The Acts of Peter. You may have heard of like the Gospel of Thomas. You ever heard of that? Gospel of Judas? Yeah. Some of this stuff has become popular, even gotten into the news in the last 10, 20 years, when some of these early documents that purported to be authoritative Christian documents were produced with a bunch of fanciful stories like this one. You might think, well, Tom, why are you even reading that stuff? Well, because it is telling us something of how they thought about what they did in assembly. And in this document, dated around 185, it's really tough to date this one, but he equates the Lord's Supper with a sacrifice that's offered on the altar of God. Now, this is really odd thinking. I think 100 years earlier, the first century church would have said, what? What are you talking about? Well, let's go on with this idea. 190, now this is Irenaeus. He was more respected than the Acts of Peter. He says, we make an offering to God of the bread and the cup of blessing. He's talking about the Lord's Supper. And then when we have perfected the offering, we invoke the Holy Spirit, that the receivers of these antitypes may obtain remission of sins and life eternal. So he not only views the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, but that by offering this sacrifice, just as the Jews would have done in the temple, you then receive forgiveness of sins. This is bizarre, because in the New Testament, taking the Lord's Supper is an act of remembrance, not an act of remission. But the idea gets going in the early church, even in the 2nd century. By late 2nd century, it's rocking and rolling. Moving down to 250 AD, Cyprian, writing from Carthage, says, "The Lord's passion is the sacrifice we offer. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you show the Lord's death until he comes." Again, the sacrifice is what? It's the Lord's Supper. It's a sacrifice. Interesting idea. So here's another conclusion thrown at you. By the late 2nd century, Christians increasingly viewed the Lord's Supper as our sacrifice given to God. And there are later documents that also support this idea. It really gets going, really gets going big time, even through the centuries. So let's talk shift number 2. Shift number 1 was the idea that the Lord's Supper becomes a sacrifice. Shift number 2 is that the ministers become priests. And I'm kind of jumping over a shift that's in between. Because if you're going to view the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, then the table on which it sits becomes an altar. This is pagan thinking. This is also Jewish thinking. They all had altars. And what do you offer on the altar? The sacrifice. Well, now Christians are starting to do the same thing. They've got their altar, and they've got their sacrifice. And then step number 3, another shift number 3 really, is that ministers become priests. And again, this makes sense, because if you've got a sacrifice that sits upon an altar, then the person presiding over that altar and that sacrifice must be a priest. This is Old Testament thinking. This is Jewish thinking. It's also pagan thinking. All the pagan temples, and they were everywhere in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century. In all the cities, temples are everywhere. They all have sacrifices, altars, and priests. And now the Christians get them too by this time. And as early as 95 AD, Clement has a comment that kind of gets this idea going that our ministers are priests, literal priests. He says, "The Master commanded us to perform at the appointed times the offerings and services." The offerings and services. "For to the priests the proper office has been assigned, and upon the Levites the proper ministries have been imposed." He's hailing back to Old Testament ideas, and he's seeing himself and other bishops as the fulfillment of this type-antitype kind of idea. The type is the priest in the Old Testament, and now he is a priest in the New Testament idea. But as we know, we looked at this in weeks number 2 and 3, all Christians are priests. That's something confirmed a number of times in the New Testament. It never identifies ministers or any kind of clergy individuals as some special elite class of holy people who should be called priests. We are all the holy priesthood in the New Testament. Jumping up to 105, Ignatius, in his letter to the Smyrnians, says, "Only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop, or whomever he designates, is to be considered valid." Now, he doesn't use the word priest here, but the idea here is that you cannot partake of the Lord's Supper unless a bishop is the one who is presiding over that sacrifice on that altar with the priest. So the power is starting to get slowly invested in these few people who are now in this key role over the church. Let's jump up to 190 AD. Irenaeus writes here. He says, all the apostles of the Lord are priests, who do inherit neither lands nor houses, but they serve God and the altar continually. Now, he doesn't say that all Christians are priests. He says that the apostles are priests. He doesn't say that the ministers are priests, but he's starting to think that, well, the apostles definitely were priests. But is that found in the New Testament? No, it's not. Advancing up to 200, Tertullian writing. He says he's upset with some heretics, some bad Christians who are going off in a wrong tangent. He says their ordinations in their churches are carelessly administered, capricious, and changeable. At one time, they put novices in office. For even on laymen do they impose the duties of priesthood. Now here, you're definitely getting to see a clergy-laity distinction developing by 200 AD, where you don't see that in the New Testament. Everybody is one. And you remember Jesus, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And he talked to the elders, don't lord it over anybody. You're to be the servant of all. But here, only certain people can be priests, and the bad people are ones who allow laymen to be priests. Jumping up to 250, Cyprian goes hog wild with this idea of ministers being priests. He refers to it so many times. This is a good example here in one of his epistles. He says, I hear that certain presbyters, these are like elders, neither mindful of the gospel nor giving the bishop the honor of his priesthood and of his dignity, are already communicating with the lapsed and giving them the Eucharist. See, only the priests can administer the Eucharist. And in the New Testament, it's a meal that everybody enjoys when they sit around in their gatherings. There's no indication that it's important who presides over the thing or who gives it to anybody. It's something everybody joins in together. But now you're in trouble if you're one of those people who are giving the Eucharist to people and not denying the bishop the honor of his priesthood and his dignity. 250 AD. Jumping up to 320, we get to Eusebius again. He has this oration where he's dedicating one of these Constantinian churches. He starts off the oration saying, friends and priests of God. He's actually talking to a room full of priests, of bishops, actual bishops. Ye who are clad in the sacred gown, adorned with the celestial crown of glory. The guys are also walking around in these sacred gowns now. It's not just a regular gown. It's a sacred gown. My goodness. And they are priests of God. Things have changed already dramatically from the first century as we enter into the 4th century here. And then if you go even further, like 380, it really should be almost off the chart here. This is the Apostolic Constitutions. It makes this amazing statement. The bishop is the mediator between God and you in the several parts of your divine worship. He is, next after God, your earthly God. I'm probably sensationalizing this a little bit too much, but the cojones on these guys just amazes me how much they viewed themselves. And now they're not just priests, they are earthly gods. They are the mediator between God and man. And in the New Testament, who's the mediator between God and man?
Jesus.
Jesus. Nobody else. There's no other layers in this whole thing. Wow. So by this time, it's taken off on its own into a world all of its own. So, another conclusion to throw at you here. By the mid-3rd century, Christians increasingly viewed their ministers as the priests who handled the sacrifice that sat upon the altar. Right. Now let's go for one more shift. The building I somehow lost my video connection. That's not good. I was doing so well, too. So shift number 3 now. The building becomes a temple. And this makes sense, too. If you have a sacrifice that sits on an altar, that's presided over by a priest, then the building in which this stuff takes place must therefore be a temple. Jews did it that way. I mean, read through your Old Testament. This is just full of sacrifices and altars and priests and one temple. All the pagans were doing it. They had a sacrifice, an altar, and a priest, and a temple. They're all throughout the early world of the first 3-4 centuries. But let's jump to 220 here. There's no temple. The buildings are not being called temples this early. This is a later development. By 220, though, there's this interesting phrase in Hippolytus of Rome. He says, the God-fearing man should consider it a great loss if he does not go to the place where they give instruction. If a teacher is there, let none of you be late in arriving at the assembly, at the place where they give instruction. The interesting thing about this verse is it starts to draw attention to the place. Because up to this time, they're meeting in somebody's home, and they might meet in Bob's house this time and over in Sally's house next week. The place has no importance at all, but now there's some importance being given to the place where they give instruction. And it may still be a home, but he's calling, there's some importance to the place here. It's not really well developed, but advancing up to 240 AD, this is where you don't have the church fathers referring to this, but what you have is archaeology helping us. The Dura Europos church in Syria is the earliest identified Christian church building. We know this from archaeology. The church in Dura Europos, which is a town in far eastern Syria that, by the way, today is under the control of ISIS. And even though we didn't find the Dura Europos church until the 1930s, we had good time to get in there and, get the shovels and the brooms and get it all dug out and whisked off so that you could see what's exactly there. And it's quite marvelous. We've got photos, we've got all kinds of evidence from it. But since ISIS has taken over, it is actually feared today that they have destroyed it, which is really a shame. It's really an archaeological find to find the earliest known Christian church building. But even this Christian church building was a house. It was a house that was converted to a gathering place for Christians. It had this assembly room here. The courtyard was in the middle. You entered over here. You came in. It's got this porch out this way. They had a room for a baptistry here, and the baptistry was still there. And on the wall, there was paintings of Christian New Testament scenes of the Good Shepherd and things like this. Very interesting. The assembly room here is actually 2 rooms where they blew out a wall back in around 240 AD, somewhere around here. It's probably 2 different bedrooms. You got into it this way, and you can also get into it this way. But the room now it's smaller than this room, by the way. It's only about coming in, this wall would be here, and this wall would be about here over to that back. So it's like 2 bedrooms put together, 2 large bedrooms put together, and people would come into there and sit and have their assemblies. But again, it's not a church building as we would think of it. It's a house that was converted for the purposes of a church. That's in 240. That's the oldest known meeting place of Christians that has been found. Now, jumping up 50 years, is the Aqaba Church in Jordan. It's the world's oldest known purpose-built Christian church. The oldest known building that was built for the specific purpose of being a gathering place for Christians. And you can see a picture of it being dug out here. It's quite a marvel. This was discovered in 1998. Yeah, there's still this stuff to be found over there. And as they look at it, they can tell that, yeah, there's a baptistry there, and they can figure out where the meeting place was. And I think it's this one. They're looking for the altar. The archaeologists are confused. Why isn't there an altar here? Well, I'm not so sure they had one that was anything other than a table up to this point. But anyway, they couldn't find one there. The Aqaba Church. Look it up on Wikipedia. There's a pretty good article about that, as well as the Dura Europos Church. It's fascinating stuff. But now, the turning point takes place with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. The Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan is when Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius declared Christianity to be religio licita, a legal religion. For the first time, Christians had the right to meet together, to build buildings if they wanted, to do whatever they wanted. It's not as though they're preferred at this point, but they now get the right to exist with the Edict of Milan. But really, the turning point, you might say, takes place a year earlier than that with this. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Let me back this up. This is the Milvian Bridge right here on the Tiber River just outside of Rome, just northeast of Rome. Here's what's going on here. There are, at this point in 312, there's 3 or 4 co-emperors of Rome. Each one had different areas of the Roman Empire to be in charge of. But, once you're emperor of one, you got to be emperor of all. And so they got to fighting for the right to have the whole thing. And this is what's going on here. Constantine marches into Rome, comes across the Alps, down into Italy, down to Rome, where Maxentius, his rival emperor, who already controls that area, and they're ready to do battle at the Milvian Bridge, right here. Constantine is a pagan. Maxentius is a pagan as well. But on the night before the battle, I think it was October the 27th of 312, Constantine, there's 2 different stories on this. One is from Lactantius and one is from Eusebius. Constantine has a dream, has a vision, where he looks up into the heavens and he sees this statement, en tutoi nika, which means by this conquer. And he sees the image of the Christian cross. Now, there's a little difference. As Lactantius tells this story, it's the image of a cross. When Eusebius tells this story, who got the story from Constantine himself, it's not the image of a cross, it's the Chi Rho, which is this image here. There. This is, the X is a Chi, it's a CH in English, and a Rho, it looks like a P, but that's an R, and CHR are the first letters in the word Christ. And the Chi Rho got to be a Christian symbol for many centuries back at this time. And so Constantine, after receiving this vision, he throws together a bunch of Chi Rhos, and the guys in the battle who carry the banners, so it's got to be a tough job, right? But he's carrying a banner out there in front, and he's battling under the Chi Rho symbol, the Christian symbol. Constantine knows it's the Christian symbol. He thinks he's had a vision from the Christian God to battle Maxentius by this. And it's kind of interesting because Constantine probably was grossly outnumbered by Maxentius' forces. But they go into battle, and Constantine routs him. Maxentius is killed. Constantine cuts off his head and carries it through the streets of Rome. That's a great thing to do, by the way. If you ever get a chance to go to one of those, be sure to have your smartphone with you to take pictures. But that's what they would do back then. But this big victory that Constantine had when the odds were kind of against him, he attributed this to the Christian God, and from then on, things changed dramatically. By the way, Nancy and I took this picture with Nancy just less than a year ago. We were in Rome And Ron, you may recognize, we're standing on the upper floor of the Roman Colosseum and looking out, and there's this. This is the Arch of Constantine, which was built in 313, the year after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in honor of Constantine's big victory over Maxentius. And this still exists to this day. So none of this, I'm not making this stuff up, just in case you were wondering. So also in 313, Eusebius writes, Constantine then, after this victory by the Christian God, he makes the priests of God his counselors, and deemed it incumbent upon himself to honor with all devotion the God who had appeared to him. And this feeling stays with Constantine throughout his life. He's deeply in debt to the Christians for what, the Christian God for what has happened to him. He sees it as the Christian God is the one who got him into this role as the emperor. And he makes the priests of God. Now, Constantine would have been accustomed to this word priest, because in the pagan world that you had priests in all your temples and all that stuff. So he's doing it. In 314, Licinius, though, is still the co-emperor. He's in another part of the world. I think he's based in Istanbul. But Licinius is still going after Christians at this time. Even though Licinius co-signed the Edict of Milan in 313, which granted a legal right to Christians to exist. But Licinius still goes after Christians. He razed some of the churches of God to the ground. Some were closed so that no one accustomed to frequent them could get into them to render God the service due him. So Licinius is a bad guy, and eventually Constantine goes after him and defeats Licinius as well. And Constantine has then sole control over the entire Roman Empire, and it's thanks to the Christian God, and things change dramatically for the Christians at that point. As Eusebius says, there was incessant joy among the Christians. Church buildings were revived. Temples again rising from the soil to a lofty height, receiving a splendor far exceeding those that had been formerly destroyed. Constantine builds these things, by the way. Constantine does. With his own personal funds, as well as with empire funds. I mean, the taxpayers were mostly pagans. Their dollars they paid in taxes to the Roman Empire is being used now to build these magnificent cathedrals for the Christians. And the Christians are thrilled. But there's some problems that go along with that whole theology. Eusebius says they had the performances of sacred rites and the solemn rituals of the church, the divine and sacred mysteries being performed. The mystic symbols of our Savior's passion were celebrated. It's talking about the Lord's Supper. But all of a sudden now you see Christians, they're just not just gathering together to encourage one another and have an agape feast. They're performing sacred rites and solemn rituals and sacred mysteries and mystic symbols, all this stuff going on. It seems appropriate to have that when you've got priests and you've got altars and you've got sacrifices and these magnificent temples. Constantine, it's been guessed that he built somewhere around 40 churches, and none of them are these Morton building churches. They're magnificent. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, if you've ever been there, that was first built by Constantine. The Church of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople, it was built by Constantine initially. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, built by Constantine in all of this era, as well as dozens of others throughout the Mediterranean basin at this time. All this happening with government funding and Constantine's personal support. Eusebius talks about these buildings be a holy temple of God when he spoke once to dedicate one of these buildings. A new and holy. See, it's not just a temple of God, which is a big enough step from New Testament thinking. It's a holy temple of God. In 325, he'll again write, when he writes a document about the life of Constantine, for the Council of Nicaea, which takes place in 325. Constantine provided travel expenses, imperial escorts, and lodging for hundreds of attending bishops to the council, along with instructions to heighten the splendor of the festival at the emperor's expense. That's the kind of support that Constantine gave to the Christians and to the Council of Nicaea. He was even somewhat influential in some of the decisions being made there, which is a little scary. 335, Eusebius has an oration in praise of Constantine later on, and he says, our Savior once more adorned the world through Constantine with holy temples, consecrated houses of prayer, sacred buildings, and hallowed edifices, and they're all called churches or houses of the Lord. I referred to this earlier, but I wanted to kick it again here later, because this is the context in which it happens after Constantine begins this massive effort to build these churches. So conclusion number 5 is after Constantine legalized Christianity in 313, Christians increasingly viewed their buildings as holy temples. Big change. So this is the progression you see. Christians had a sacrifice, the Lord's Supper. And if you have a sacrifice, you must have an altar. And if you have an altar, you got to have a priest. And if you have a priest and all these other things, you got to have a temple. And so Christians now had all these things just like everybody else in the world. The pagans had it. The Jews used to have it before the temple was built or destroyed. But now the Christians have it as well. I cited this statement by Everett Ferguson a few weeks ago. He described what worship meant in the ancient world. It meant temple, with its accompanying statue of the god, altar for the sacrifice of animals, and priesthood. Once you've got these 4 things, sacrifice, altar, priest, and temple, then you have worship. In the biblical sense, too. Even in the New Testament biblical sense. That's what comprised worship in the ancient world. And now the Christians could have all that too, because they had all those 4 things now. Literal things. A literal sacrifice, a literal altar, a literal priest, and a literal temple. But there's some problems to this. Let me back up a second, just introduce this. I wrote a paper on this in my doctoral work. I took a class on the early church at a doctoral level. I wanted to get deep into this topic because I wanted to study this closer. And I wrote a paper that basically had everything I've told you here so far. And I just wanted to share what happened. And I shared in my paper so far what I've told you. But my teacher came back to me and says, Tom, I want you to add a section to this where you assess why this stuff is a problem. And I didn't really want to get into being judgmental. You know how I am. My wife just rolled her eyes big time right now. But there's a problem to this. And so Howard Marshall, one of the well-known evangelical scholars, said there's nothing in the New Testament that suggests that the Lord's Supper is to be seen in any way as an offering or a sacrifice by us to God. And the practice of offering the elements to God, the elements of the Lord's Supper to God, reverses the whole direction of the atonement in which God offers himself, his Son, to die for us. Not we offering a sacrifice back to God in order to get forgiveness. Yeah. We get things backwards through all this. Now, here's another statement I ran across that Robert Marcus, another early church analyst, he says, in the first centuries of Christianity, it was a religion highly inhospitable to the idea of holy places. But by the end of the 4th century, it had become highly receptive. I mean, Christians now get to have these magnificent buildings on every street corner and have all the prowess and prestige in town of not just being a legal religion, but thanks to Constantine, it became the preferred religion. And it wasn't too many years later that idol worship became banned in the empire and the Christians dominated. You might think that's a good thing, but you know, we turn into a bunch of jerks when that takes place. So why did the later church embrace temple concepts? Here's just 3 guesses. Why did they do that? Why did they want to call the Lord's Supper a sacrifice? Why did they want to call that altar? Why did they want to do this priest thingy and the temple thing? There was a tendency, and there's a human tendency among anybody, to sacralize things. If you find something meant a lot to you, it then becomes sacred to you. It becomes holy. It becomes very special. And you start to maybe even find Old Testament concepts to apply to these things, which the early Christians did. All those things of sacrifice, altar, priest, and temple, Old Testament ideas, that they resurrected these and made all this stuff sacred and holy in the early Christian church. Another reason why they may have done it, this is me guessing now, is I think there was a need for social approval. You know, by 320, the Christians had been persecuted for almost 3 full centuries. They'd been looked down upon in town. They had to be rather quiet about them being Christians. They couldn't be proud of this to anybody else. And some other people would even turn them in if it was known that they were a Christian. But finally, they're not just legal. They're in charge. The emperor's my man. He's on my side. And so now they have social approval, but they also turn into a bunch of jerks. And history will show that to be true as well. The Christian behavior starts to leave the Christians at this time. And another thing that I think may have been a reason for all this was a growing sense of elitism among the clergy. I mean, all this stuff revolved around the clergy. They got to be the priests. Nobody touches the Lord's Supper but me. I'm the guy, and you got to do what I say. And if you don't have me there, what you do doesn't count. That's actually there in the 2nd century. You can't even meet without the bishop being present. So this elitism that went along with these priests of God who wore the holy, sacred gown. So I think that's also contributing to the problem here. Whereas Jesus saw the leaders being the servants of all, now they're the lords over everybody, dictating what takes place. And it becomes a problem. My question is, do these things have sin-remitting power? I think that's the question. And to put it a different way, since these things constitute worship, when we do what we think is, when we call worship, do we think that that has sin-remitting power? Do you think that by attending worship, your sins are forgiven? You know, the old idea that you can do what you want during the week, but then and go to church on Sunday and get forgiven again, take the Lord's Supper, I'm cleansed, and back at it again. I mean, what, did you think that by going to church this has sin-remitting power? Are we essentially denying the effectiveness of Jesus' sacrifice? Throughout the book of Hebrews, it says Jesus' sacrifice was a once-for-all sacrifice, done one time for all time, and it is sufficient. But have we resurrected a system where it's not really enough anymore? We got to go to church, and we got to do all that stuff, and then we get forgiven. Something's wrong with our thinking. I don't think that this is New Testament thinking. So let's summarize this. It's a timeline here. Remember, the New Testament was written in the 1st century. The Lord's Supper becomes a sacrifice. It's the first development here, happening early in the 2nd century. Then soon, the table on which it sat became an altar. Then the priests came along a little bit later on in the 3rd century. Ministers began being known as priests. Then temples get to be built with Constantine and Christianity becoming legal. And by then, what you've got really, Christians are worshiping in their temples with their priests and their altars and their sacrifice. Now, historically, There are still some churches that view their Lord's Supper as a sacrifice. It's actually there in their liturgy, and I've been to some of these churches where they actually state it out loud. In a lot, it's not too many churches still that. There's still some, a lot of them around the, but not that many. The altar is still there in most churches, but there's no biblical authorization for Christians to have some sacred altar upon which sacrifices are. Why we do that? That's just not there biblically. But we still have this idea is there. I'm not saying you're all going to hell if you have something called an altar in your building. We have an altar call in a lot of churches. Well, what's special about going to this thing we call an altar, and we got to have a call that we come to the altar, and something special happens there that can't happen elsewhere? How did this get so special? We still have some churches, actually several denominations, that call their ministers priests. There's still some churches that call their churches temples. Not too many. That terminology has mostly fallen by the wayside, but they still call it a house of God. They still call it a house of worship, which is a temple. So a lot of this terminology is still with us to this day. And certainly our worship terminology is everywhere. So let's recap why the early church didn't have worship services. I'm just going to put these on the screen and not read them again because I'm really tired. But the fourth point is this one. Worship language developed by the 4th century as the church gradually reverted to literal temple concepts. And next week, we're going to talk about the biblical purpose of going to church, where I try to wrap up everything. And if you want to know, you can put a gun to my head and actually force me next week to tell you what I think we should be doing in our assemblies. And more importantly, you'll get a chance. I'd rather hear from you than from me. I'm already tired of hearing myself talk. But let's try to take this new viewpoint, which is actually a very, very old viewpoint. It's biblical, about what the assembly was about, and figure out how could we do this and do this better. That'll be next week in our conversations.